Today's Breakfast Bible Bites in Psalm 44:4 takes us into the prophetic as we learn that God still protects his special possession, Israel. Psalm 44 and verse 4 reads, "You are my king, O God. Command victories for Jacob." Jacob, of course, is more than a man. He was God's rootstock for the nation of Israel. David's prayer is for Israel's victory as a nation, while keeping in mind all of the promises of God and looking forward to the day when the Messiah will reign as king in the land. Verse 5 reads, "Through you we will push back our adversaries. Through your name we will trample down those who rise up against us." Perhaps this was written for David's time, or it was inspired by God's Spirit to be prophetic about the many events in Israel's future, including those of the last days, or perhaps, as the Spirit often does in the Word, intended it for both. God is not done with protecting Israel, and according to his Word, he will continue to do as he has done as many times in the past when he protected her from Pharaoh's army and her numerous encounters with the Philistines. The Six-Day War of 1967 presents itself as a modern example of God's intervention. Notice that it was only a 6-day war. On the seventh day, God rested. In the War of 67, Israel was seriously outmanned and outgunned. God stood up for his people, overthrowing all of her adversaries. We read about this event back in my notes in Psalm 33. But as you may well know, repetition is the mother of knowledge, so let's review it again. Listed there in my notes was the documentation about God's victory. And they are again recorded here, where we will read again about the overwhelming superior strength of Israel's adversaries as they amassed their military troops against this fledgling nation. Israel had a marginal force of only 264,000 troops, including reservists, and only about 200 operational fighter jets. On the enemy's side, there were 100 Iraqi tanks and an infantry division that was readied near the Jordanian border, along with 2 squadrons of Soviet-built aircraft, Hawker Hunters, and with a heavy quota of top-of-the-line MiG-21s that were also rebased adjacent to the Jordanian border. Egypt had by far the largest and most modern of all the Arab forces, having amassed over 420 combat aircraft. The combined Arab air forces were aided by volunteer pilots from the Pakistani Air Force in an independent capacity, and by with some aircraft from Libya, Algeria, Morocco, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia together, all made up for the massive losses suffered on the first day of the war. On the eve of the war, Egypt had amassed approximately 100,000 of its 160,000 troops in the Sinai, including all 7 divisions, 4 infantry, 2 armored, and 1 mechanized. 4 independent infantry brigades and 4 independent armor brigades. A third of them were veterans of Egypt's intervention in the Yemen civil war, and another third were reservists. These forces had 950 tanks, 1,100 APCs, and more than 1,000 artillery pieces. Syria's army, which is on the northern side of Israel, had a total strength of 75,000 troops and amassed them along the Syrian border. Jordan's army had 55,000 troops, 300 tanks along the Jordanian border, 250 of which were U.S.-made M48 Patton tanks, along with the sizable amounts of M113 APCs, a new battalion of mechanized infantry, and a paratrooper battalion trained in the U.S.-built schools. They also had 12 battalions of artillery and 6 batteries of 81 millimeter and 120 millimeter mortars. Now, you and I might think that the annihilation of Israel was inevitable. Think again. For God was on her side. Israel reports 760 casualties, while the Arab deaths they hovered over 18,000 men. And now we know historically that Israel's God was the victor. So while we rethink this as a modern application of David and Goliath situation, one that continues even to this day, let's stop and think again about the passage in the Psalm, verse 5. Through you we will push back our adversaries. Through your name we will trample down those who rise up against us. Today she faces another equally strong threat from Iran, and if she will only look to her God with jubilant valor, coupled with the faithful prayers of the evangelical church, God will again make her victorious. Perhaps this will build the faith of remnant Israel to preserve her during the coming judgments of the last days. Romans 8:31 says, "What shall we say about such wonderful things as these? If God is with us, who can be against us?" Besides validating that God is always victorious where his people are concerned, you and I might be asking, what does it have to do with me, or what do I have to do with Israel? If you've been following any of my free weekly e-Bible studies on the Psalms, then you are aware of how prophetic they are concerning the last days. We read in Psalm 122 and verse 6, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you prosper." That prayer may have personal application in our own lives.